So first, just I want to welcome our speaker, Josh Katz. Thank you for being here. We're just going to do a couple announcements. First, Entertainment Weekly is looking for a full-time visualization person to join their team. Part of the digital innovations team there. We've got a full write-up. We've got a lot more information about it. But if anybody's interested in working in media on the data viz side, that's an interesting opportunity. Paul will be sending out, I think, an email with the full description for anyone who's interested, and you can ask us afterwards as well, and we can share the contact information with them. We've got another one. There's an interesting opportunity with an organization called Objective Health. They're looking for somebody who's willing to relocate up to Waltham, Mass. But it is a it's senior products developer, and it's a product that is focused on health-related data and providing visualization and analysis to hospitals and other health providers about how they're doing, what their outcomes are, and things like that. So again, we will be sending out that description, but if you have questions, please let us know. And I think both of these are brand new opportunities that we've have just come up with in the last day or so. They contacted us directly. That's why we're sharing them with you, not because they're like buying ad space from us. All right, and so one other thing, I'm going to attach this tag. Many of you may have seen this. This falls into the category not of announcement, but thing that everybody in our business should be aware of, an entire website called Spurious Correlations. There's some really wonderful content here, such as how U.S. spending on science, space, and technology clearly correlates directly with suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. Number of films Nicolas Cage appeared in. There's definitely a lot of mortality and morbidity here. The divorce rate in Maine with margarine. But again, you can see how close these curves are to each other. And I think this is just a reminder to us that with great power comes great responsibility. And our craft of data visualization, of taking information and making it visual and creating apparent relationships between data sets is a very powerful thing that can persuade people of all kinds of crazy things. Be careful. Be careful how you apply the great power of data visualization. And then also, this is a great way when you're working with somebody who's absolutely dead convinced that because these two curves look so similar, there must be meaning there. Just point them at this website, and they will be disabused, perhaps, of that notion, or at least you'll have a shot at it. TylerVegan.com, an excellent asset for our business. And so I think that's it for announcements.
Yeah, I mean, it's right there on the screen, but maybe it's worth just verbalizing one more time as well. We have a Twitter. Is that called a Twitter account? Or what is that?
That's our Twitter handle.
Twitter handle.
DataVizNYC.
DataVizNYC. So you should all follow us because we do make announcements about events and visualization related stuff going on around. And that's another way that you can get information about visualization related things that are going around locally in the city. Okay.
Okay, excellent. We'll have Josh come up. We'll get the camera going and the recording going, and get him set up, and we'll have things going in just a second. But while he comes up, please give a warm welcome to Josh Katz from the Center.
right? So a lot of the stuff that we do is intended for the web. And that's where you'll see a lot of the really, really great things like these big immersive interactives, like this one about the South China Sea, that combine original reporting and video and these animated maps and all of these things together into this one immersive experience. So you'll have things like that. You also have these large interactives, like this one that was published recently. It's called How the Recession Reshaped the Economy in 255 charts, because we were getting sort of tired of the everything in one chart thing that keeps repeating, so we wanted to play around with that a little bit, and instead of in one chart, in 255 charts. But yeah, so it's things like this that are really interesting and engaging. And so in graphics, there's about 30 or 40 of us. There's a whole range of backgrounds. So you'll have people straight out of, that just come from a straight journalism background. You have designers, artists, people who are just coders, like are more do computer science and coding and things like that. For me, I came out of statistics. So a year ago, I was in grad school for statistics, getting a master's degree. And as part of that, in the spring semester last year, for my final project for one of my classes, we were tasked with, so it was a spatial statistics class, and the final project was just, all right, find a data set you're interested in, do something with it. And that was it. It was very open-ended, and it was great. He could have just assigned, a final exam, like most professors did, but instead he was like, find something you're interested in, make something with it. And from that initial prompt came these dialect maps that I made last year. So once this loads, so these came out about a year ago. They sort of caught fire on the internet a little bit. And eventually, this would lead to the Dialect quiz, which came out in December. But first, before I get into the Dialect quiz, I just want to go through the background of how these maps were made really quickly, of just sort of the inspiration behind them and the process of actually making them. What's,
Shiny app.
I'm sorry, what's that?
It's Shiny app.
That's right, yeah. I can get back into that in a bit, but at the time I made these, I had never done anything with JavaScript before. I didn't know web development. All I knew how to do was to code in R. But using this package called Shiny in R, I was able to make this website. So this entire website was done in R. Both the maps and the website itself, it was all coded in R. So if you like R and you haven't tried Shiny, I would strongly recommend it. So the data behind these maps started with this dialect survey that was conducted 10 years ago by a linguistics professor, Bert Vox, and a grad student, Scott Golder. And it was 122 questions. All right. So it encompassed differences in pronunciation, so whether you say pajamas or pajamas. Vocabulary, things like whether you call it a sub, a hoagie, or a grinder. By the way, the correct answer is hoagie. And also syntax, so whether a sentence like is, like I might could do that, whether that's an acceptable phrase or not. most people would say no.
Do we know anything about where they, what kind of control they did on their respondents? Like online surveys are a little.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. If you guys didn't hear that, the question was about their data collection methods. Because online surveys are sort of notorious for not being statistically sound. And they actually didn't do much of a control for things like that. So from a purely statistically rigorous perspective, there are some issues with the data because it's an online survey. But ultimately, I think the data set, normally to get data like this, you have to have linguistics researchers going out into the field and conducting these one-on-one interviews with people in person. That's how linguistics research was done. And you just couldn't have a data set of this size, and it's just, the data ends up being just so rich that it's sort of hard to ignore. So it's true that it might not be as statistically sound, but we kind of just ignore that.
Do you think there's a problem where something can go viral if it sort of looks, plausible and nobody
Sure. I mean,
things like that?
Yeah, like it's definitely, tons of stuff can go viral. Hopefully, if it can go viral and impart some kind of knowledge and be done in a sort of smart way and help to educate people a little bit. Hopefully it can do that just a bit, but it's hard to do.
This is kind of a bit like the 1952 Truman problem. In a sense that you could have Dewey winning, because they did a survey and by telephone, but people who own telephones.
Sure.
And then people who may not have computers and therefore
Sure.
they.
No, absolutely. Like you'll have a lot of basically sampling issues with online surveys, right? Because especially when this data was made, this data came from about 10 or 15 years ago, when the internet was not nearly as widespread as it is today. Which is a very good point. Okay, which brings me to this. So what would you guys call this bug? Just an example. What? Yeah, roly-poly. I don't know what? That is a new one. I heard woolly bug. And I heard potato bug. What's that? Sow bug? That is also a new one for me. But so this is the map that he asked. This was one of the questions of those 122 that he asked. And this was the map of that original data. So you have pill bug, doodle bug, potato bug, roly-poly, sow bug. There it is. And so this is plotting the data as each response is just a single color-coded point, right? So in a sense, this is the purest representation of the data. Right? You're just taking where the response was and plotting it on the map. But you'll notice right away, this map has some flaws, right? So in the Northeast, the points are so dense that it's difficult to tell which responses are really dominating in certain areas, right? You also have the problem in the West. The responses, it's sort of the opposite problem. The responses are so sparse that it's hard to get a sense of which of these dialect variations is really coming to dominate. So this was data that these maps were on the internet, and I just sort of stumbled onto them when I was a college student, and I just found them really interesting, and so I wanted to try and approach this data in a different way, just to try and visualize it and get a better sense of what the data was really saying, of sort of the story that lay underneath it. So common approaches are that point-referenced version that was before. The other typical approach is just to make a choropleth map. And so for that, you're dividing the region based on some administrative boundary, usually a state or a county, and then just averaging within that region. But this has its own problems, right? For one, things like language, culture, are these naturally continuous kinds of data, right? And when you make a choropleth map, you're imposing these spatial divisions on the data. And you're saying if you're on this side of this boundary, things are this way, and as soon as you cross the boundary, things are completely different, right? And we know that that's not actually the way things are, especially with data like this. You're not going to see that kind of a sharp change with something like language. And it also doesn't solve the data sparseness problem. So you'll have states like Montana or Wyoming where the entire state is going to be determined by just a few observations. So my approach was, since the data was continuous, it was a continuous phenomenon, I want to map it in a continuous way. So I thought, all right, let's just think of each data point. I'm sorry, this gets a little math heavy. Apologize for that in advance. So you can think of each data point as like a random variable. So like think of it like a weighted die, if that helps. And it's gonna, at each location, it's weighted in a different way. And we're trying to figure out what those weights are. The way I approached it was using what's called a k-nearest neighbor algorithm. So you start, if you wanted a prediction at a certain location, you would look at the k nearest neighbors, so say the 100 nearest observations, and then average those. And it also incorporated this kernel smoothing aspect. So you're not taking a straight average, it's a weighted average. The thinking being, well, the closer an observation is to a location, the more likely, the more information you'd be able to get out of that observation if you're trying to figure out what the true probability is at a certain point. And if you notice, and again, this is a little bit math heavy, but there's 3 parameters that you need to pick. And depending which parameters you pick, you get these very different fits. So this was actually for the soda, pop, Coke question. Whether you call it soda, pop, or Coke. In this map, red is soda, blue is pop, and green is Coke. And you can see, so these 4 maps are 4 different sets of parameters. And each one gives you a very different feel, a very different looking map. But I can skip that part. All right, so the other thing, once you get those probabilities, so you do that kernel density smoothing, k-nearest neighbor algorithm, then you need to visualize it, right? And it's not exactly, it's not entirely clear how you go from having this probability vector to a color, because you're mapping from, in this case, it's a simplex into the RGB color space, so you're losing dimensions. So you have to decide what's important. On the one hand, the data is both categorical and quantitative, right? Because at a given location, it's either going to be, say, very much soda territory or very much pop territory. So it's categorical. But it's also quantitative, right? Because it might be very strongly soda territory or it might be weakly soda territory. So what I did was, to address the categorical side of things, I started with these different color gradients for each response. To address the quantitative side of things, I sort of mush them together and then pick a color based on this interpolated color gradient. And then lastly, I pulled the color back to white depending on how strongly those 2 answers dominated. And that gives you maps like this.
Wait, you mentioned going back to white, if there's a high 3rd color, but were there ever 4 categories or more categories?
Yes, and a lot of them there were many more than 4.
Right.
And that's one of those things that ultimately you are going to be losing something. When you try and put everything together in one map, you have to make sacrifices, right? So you're going to be losing some information. And you just have to decide, well, which information am I going to sacrifice, or which information is the most important to try and get across the point that I want to get across, or that I think the data is saying.
I was curious to know, is this interpolation method similar to prigging in biostatistics? Sorry, geostatistics.
It's sort of a different approach. I mean, they're both these spatial smoothing techniques. It's a slightly different approach than kriging, but they're motivated by the same idea, by trying to do some kind of spatial smoothing or spatial correlation in the data. But it's very similar. All right, so now I'm going to skip ahead to the quiz. From these maps came the dialect quiz, which, so first, again, using Shiny, because I still didn't know JavaScript, I posted this survey online. And it's basically the same survey that I did with the Times. It was just done using Shiny on my own, collecting data, sort of a pilot study. Ultimately, I got 350,000 people to take this survey, and at the end I got a map showing them where their dialect was most similar to. And it was that data that I then used to power the Times quiz, which came out in December, and which ultimately became the most trafficked thing in Times history, which is crazy. This was the first thing I coded in JavaScript, by the way. Thank you. I had help. So yeah, so this is the quiz. It's 25 questions. You answer. As you answer, it gives these little mini maps pop out, showing you basically where that particular answer shows up. The thinking being that 25 questions is kind of a lot of questions to ask. Like there's 140 questions in the data set I have, and I know that there are some people out there that would gladly sit through a 140 question dialect quiz, but to make it a little bit more palatable for a general audience, I cut it down to 25. But even then, that's still a good number of questions for people to sit through, so we wanted to give something to people to keep them interested and keep them going and get them to the end of the quiz. And we thought that these mini maps helped a lot. So you could answer for this, the night before Halloween, to me, is Mischief Night, which is a very South Jersey, Philadelphia thing. It was only after I left South Jersey that I learned that people in the rest of the country don't call it Mischief Night, and are just like, why do you throw toilet paper on things? But so yeah, so you go through 25 questions, and at the end, you get a map. So these are my results. As you can see, it's really not that hard. I say sneakers, I say Mischief Night, and I say sun shower and hoagie, and it knows, it's like, all right, you're from South Jersey. And that was another thing. Actually, one of the things that pilot quiz really helped with is it enabled me to see how people were reacting to it. One of the biggest comments I got after people took it was, oh, I wish I knew which questions helped the quiz peg my dialect. So when we made the Times version, we added that to the end. So at the end, you get these 3 little mini maps that show you which questions most helped the quiz sort of place you in the country. Yeah?
How did you choose the 25 questions? Was it just what was most predictive, or?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So if you didn't hear, the question was how I chose which 25 questions to use. And ultimately, it was a lot of simulating. So based on those responses I already had, I sort of had a sense of which responses went together. So I simulated things, tried different sets of questions. Ultimately, it's random. so you don't get the same set of 25 questions each time, which is another thing that I think helps contribute to the quiz's popularity, is because people would take it multiple times and get different questions and then keep coming back to it and get a slightly different answer. So it was ultimately, I think it's pulling from a question bank of about 35 questions. Yeah, and we had played with the idea of having it be dynamic, of having it pick which question to ask you next based on your responses already. But ultimately, that ended up being it was a lot of extra computation, and the end result was not that much more impressive, or it wasn't that much better than what we were getting already, so we decided just to have it be purely random on our part. Is there a question?
How do you pick your 25 questions? I mean, like, I have to pick my 25 questions right carefully. Communication types. So how do you get away with like this simple user?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
Like, how do you pick your first 25 and then randomly, like, basing on this question, and then the other random 25 questions?
No, it's all
Without
random.
getting into trouble.
It's all random. Like the 25 questions are just randomly selected, and that's just purely random.
No one
So.
complains and like.
No.
But why the 35? Were they the ones that were most effective at helping you to localize people, or?
Yeah, the 35, we narrowed it from 140 to 35 based on which questions were most helpful in placing people at a certain area of the country.
What is the math behind that? Or that guy?
Someone, one of the three people. Yeah.
How did you choose the questions and answers? All from the original? Original, like 100+ question quiz?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yes, so the vast majority of them all came from the original quiz. There were 122 in that original Harvard Dialect survey. And in addition, there were 20 extra ones that I added onto the pilot quiz that I made that were just questions I found interesting that weren't in the original survey that I wanted to supplement it with. And also when I did, for those questions, I let people, if they picked other, they could put in like a custom response. And so based on the responses I was getting, I could update which choices people could pick, which was something that was really helpful. And a few of those made it into the final quiz. So like whether you call it a tractor trailer or a semi-truck, it is one of the questions in the quiz. There, a question or?
I just want, all right, so you answer the questions, it's a vector, right? It's A, B, C, A, D, A, D,
Right.
C, B.
Right.
Okay, so how do you get from that to a place? Is it just like, percentage match, or is you do some possibly spurious Bayesian mumbo jumbo, like?
No, so we elected not to do spurious Bayesian mumbo jumbo.
Spurious Bayesian mumbo jumbo.
Although not that all Bayesian statistics is spurious mumbo jumbo.
Yeah.
I want to make that clear.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Possibly.
I'd probably be more towards that camp anyway, but that's not important. Right, so, and again, I played with trying to think of it as a likelihood and multiply them all together. But again, that really ended up not producing results I was happy with. And I think the reason why is that people's dialect comes from a variety of sources, usually. Like it's not this monolithic thing that, oh, well, you were born here, so every single thing that you say comes from this place. A lot of people have a lot of different characteristics, or things that contributed to the way that they talk. So what I did was something very simple, which is just add up all of the percentages. One way of thinking of it is if you think of all of those mini-maps as elevation, right, with the red areas being higher points and the blue areas being lower points. And then you stack all 25 maps on top of each other, and then renormalize it to the right color scale, you'll get that big map, if that makes sense. Yeah.
How do you evaluate your results over different experiments?
What's that?
How did you evaluate your results like over different experiments you were trying out till you reached the final one?
I had my friends take it. I'm not entirely kidding. No, it was a mix of simulating and like literally having people I knew take the quiz and watching it. It was a version, sort of the testing version would have a map that would update as you go. So the quiz that's there now, you only get the map at the end. When I was testing it, I could watch that map change after each answer. And so based on that, just a lot of testing and seeing how it would react to the different answers, I tweaked it so I liked the response. Yeah.
Was there some sort of qualifier for minimum amount of years that can say you lived here or lived?
No. So when I collected the data, it was where were you born, or it was where were you raised, and where do you live now, were the two questions that I asked, along with age and gender. Yeah.
Sorry, could you just quickly go over again why you went with adding probability rather than multiplying?
Sure. So multiplying, if you're multiplying probabilities, you're getting like a likelihood, essentially. And it was two things. I mean, in seeing the results, I just wasn't happy with the way they looked. They didn't look right. And then in thinking about it, it made sense because it's not really a likelihood. You're not just picking this one place and saying all of your dialect comes from here. Right? Generally it's a mixture of different results. A lot of it's influenced by where your parents are from, or with a lot of people.
So just when you say it didn't look right, you're saying like you got people weighted too heavily, like if they
Yeah,
gave
it would
answers, it'd be all Jersey.
Right, it would sort of overreact to information. And I tried different approaches to have it, I don't know, to kind of shrink the estimates a little bit back to an equal probability. And ultimately, it was just a simple addition tended to produce the best results. Yeah.
So these three minimaps which are the most distinctive, do they have any higher weight when you added the probabilities, or in which way they were most distinctive?
They're the most distinctive in the sense of when you compare those cities to the other cities in the data set, you had the highest, it was like the most deviation from a typical city. That makes sense.
Maybe you'll address this later, but I wanted to ask about the performance of drawing all these maps and rendering these beautiful graphics in real time.
Sure, yeah. That's a great question, because we actually ran into some trouble with that when it launched. So the mini maps were all pre-rendered. These were actually made, the smaller maps on the bottom, both the ones that come out when you take the quiz on the side, those were all pre-rendered in R. Just made directly in R, that's just your PNG output from R. The large map has to be produced dynamically, ultimately, because there are 25 questions, a bunch of different choices for each question. You're quickly like the number of different combinations is well beyond the number that you can produce beforehand. So we set up, those calculations were done server side. It basically sends the server a vector of what the answers were, does this big matrix multiplication, and then the server would spit back values for each of those points. It may not be clear from here, but if you look closely, you can see that in the large map, it's not entirely smooth, it's pixelated. There's about 14,000 or so pixels, squares on that map. So what happens client side is after it gets the response from the server, so it has just all of these values at each point. From that, it's just a simple thing in D3 to go from a value to a color, and it's just making squares of each color at each point. Yes, one of you, you can fight it out.
When it comes to layout, because this is the first time that you're working with a new team at New York Times,
Yes.
how different is it, the end result from what you originally conceived?
This is much better. But I mean, the dynamics of it were essentially the same. Obviously, the presentation here is much better. The capabilities on server side were much, much better than I ever would have been able to do on my own. Alaska and Hawaii were included in this version, and they were not in my version. I got a lot of angry emails about that. But yeah, no, I mean, and like it had the mini maps coming out, it was dynamic and much more engaging, so it's definitely better. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if there were plans in the works to periodically collect new data and roll out new dialect maps.
So I feel like at this point, with at least data for the United States with these questions, I think this is pretty much the peak of what I would be able to produce. What I'm most interested in doing next is expanding this to other countries. So looking at Canada and Britain, Ireland, Australia.
India?
I think would be really fun. Yeah.
Why do you think that this was so popular? There's a lot of like BuzzFeed Visibly that are being shared all around. I don't know if this maybe sparked them all, but it seems like this is now a big thing, but why was this one big?
So I think this one, it was great content. It was sort of hard to screw up. It was something that really, it tells people about themselves in a sort of surprising way. So obviously you know where you're from. You don't need a 25-question quiz to tell you where you're from. You know where you're from. But what's surprising about it is that many people might not think that after just 25 questions, a quiz would be able to be this accurate. And I think there was something sort of fun in seeing how it would do. Or it would not be accurate at all, which is also kind of fun in a way. It also, we published it around Christmas time. A lot of people were back with their families. And I got a lot of emails from people saying that their families took it together and they just had a lot of fun sitting around the computer and comparing how they talked. And ultimately, it seemed to be something that people really enjoyed taking together, like literally huddled around the computer taking together. And I think there was just something really engaging about that. Yeah.
Were you surprised by how the results came out of how similarly people talk in different like cities very far away from each other? Like New York, and I think I got New York and Honolulu, which is like, I don't know.
That's actually, and that's sort of, I've heard that a few times before, because I think that has more to do with Honolulu, because it's, you get this blend of different cultural influences there, in a similar way as you do in New York. But no, that is interesting. Like, one of the things is sun shower, which is what I call when it's raining and the sun is shining, is it's a very northeast thing, but then also Minnesota. So yeah, there are some very interesting connections that you can draw with that. So yeah, that was surprising. Yeah.
Sort of after this project launch, conversations with the people who, was it Vo and Golden?
Yeah.
And did you share the data back with them, like sort of?
Sure, so I kept in touch with, there's Bert Fox and Scott Golder, and I think they were happy. It brought a lot of attention to their research and the work that they were doing, and I hope to collaborate with them more in the future, because I mean, it's been great and people really enjoyed it a lot, so, yeah.
Anything you feel you'd want to do differently next time, or that you feel like didn't come out just the
Probably the only thing is I think we would be a little bit more ready for the traffic surge. The first day we had some server issues. There was a lot of work that had to be done. We ended up recoding the entire back end to better handle the traffic. But in terms of the way the quiz worked, nothing comes to mind. Do you have any suggestions?
No, I was just curious. I mean, if as it was executed and rolled out, it was like, oh, I wish it kind of like did this. And
No, and in a way, the pilot quiz helped a lot. So I was able to kind of iron out those kinks, seeing how people reacted to it, taking the quiz the first time. So we sort of knew what to expect for this time. Yeah.
Did the Times do any analysis of where the quiz was popular? What kind of demographics it was popular with, and what platforms they were sharing it on?
That's a great question. I'm sure they did, but that's not this. I don't really partake in those conversations because that's not really my focus. But yeah, that's really all I can say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Katz, given this is an election year,
Yes.
have you tried to conceptualize like a type of thought, something like this, in terms of politics or the upcoming elections, to do a survey type? Has that been?
I mean, nothing really similar to this, although, now that you bring that up. So one of the things that I have been working on since the Dialect quiz came out with the upshot is this guy who made our Senate model. This is one of the things that we were doing with the upshot, is trying to get people to think about probability in a different way. And so if you haven't been to this page, even if you're not a politics fan, you should do it, because it has these fun spinners. So you get to click spin, and it simulates an election for you. And you can see that, so right now we're saying there's a 55% chance that the Republicans end up taking the Senate. But what does that 55% mean? It's a hard thing to conceptualize. I mean, I work in statistics, and Amanda Cox, who I work very closely with, also works in statistics, and both of us have trouble thinking, so what is 55%? And using something like this, you can actually see these probabilities play out. So like in this case, West Virginia goes to the Democrats, which is something you'd say, that's crazy, it's never going to happen. But every so often, it does. Every so often, very low probability events, if you have enough of them, one of them is going to happen. And I think things like this help to demonstrate that. Yeah, definitely. And I considered doing that. Ultimately, I felt like it was going to be too complicated to implement, so I elected not to. I guess if I did it again, that would be something that I might change. Yeah.
actually, my question is related to this. I'm curious about what information you had about the people that took the initial quiz when you conducted it. Did you collect other information?
So it was age, gender, where the person was raised, and where they live now. That was it. And then the last thing, and then I just want to share this because it's really awesome. So this technique, that spatial smoothing I was talking about before, it's not just for dialect maps. You can use it with anything. I think it works best with things like language and culture and baseball fandom, where you have these continuous phenomena and you want to map them. So using Facebook data, we made these baseball maps. It's really the same approach as the dialect maps, but instead of language, you have baseball fandom, and you can zoom way in and get the exact percentages of different fans in different counties, and it's really fun. So yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
So this new one, Baseball Nation,
Yeah.
professional sports maps, seems to have solved the problem. Well, you can't zoom in. It's beautiful maps. It's hard
Yeah.
to tell where the boundaries are. It's kind of fuzzy going to white. This puts a lot of artificial boundaries on it. Does this work any differently than the raster view? I mean, what were the challenges of producing a sort of vector view?
So this and a lot of the machinery of this was also done in R, of mapping. So we started with zip codes, and we mapped zip codes into color buckets, and then did a just polygon union of this similar color buckets to get this large polygon. That's all one color. And then we made, and a lot of this dynamic map, again, comes from working with Times Graphics and having these incredibly smart people all around you that can make things like this.
So what is the gray area in Virginia south of Washington D.C. mean? That's the part I didn't understand when I first saw this. I mean, are you saying there's nobody posting anything about baseball where there's no pro teams? I mean, is that?
It's this dynamic where if there's not a pro team, people sort of revert to being Yankees fans. So you'll see this gray, and that's why we picked gray for the Yankees, because we needed a color that would be able to, you'd be able to differentiate it from all of the other colors on the map because their boundaries sort of connected to every other color.
You have the cardinal reds almost perfect. That cuts through Indiana.
Yeah,
It's just almost it's good. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, someone asked before, why did you think your dialect thing was so well received? And my immediate thought was consider the source. I mean, it's the New York Times, and it was based on very good research. But something like BuzzFeed or this that's based on Facebook is a lot different. So how does the New York Times allow you, to present things?
Because they're so cool.
They are fun, yeah.
That's a good question. We actually there were a lot of conversations about whether it was okay to use data like this, because it's Facebook likes. But I think we tried to be clear in the article about where this data was coming from, what exactly it's showing, saying that this is using Facebook likes. There are a lot of caveats that go with it.
I read all that. But it's just an interesting question.
It is. Although, on the other hand, the data that we were using for the dialect quiz was an internet survey, right? So this wasn't it was not up to Times polling standards. But again, I think if the caveats are understood, you can still create something that's compelling and not misleading, because really all data has caveats attached to it. It's about trying to understand them and hopefully communicate them along with a good visualization.
This is Facebook like a team like a Reds or the Cubs,
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. It just, I mean, look at the Dodgers over here. I mean, that's ridiculous. It just means that a lot of these parts of the country, people have nothing to do. So they go on Facebook and they click on, hey, I like my team. Well, these people have a little bit more to do than, I mean, Dodgers are huge.
I'm not going to take a position.
They're huge.
We're gonna find something different from Twitter data.
Yeah, right.
So you said a big advantage in the dialect map was being able to have a kind of pilot program where you had posted before.
Sure.
Is it possible to replicate that? Have a little post up on your own blog before you post it on the New York Times?
It is sort of tricky now. Yeah, and we've thought about that a lot, about how we would want, if we wanted to do that again, how would we do that? And I'm not sure if that's a problem we've quite solved yet, but it's, yeah, definitely something to think about.
I'm curious if you've tried to plot the original Harvard study
back onto your visualization. And if you've seen any change over time, all of these techniques are so new, so we don't really see any of that. But I'm curious, if that is the case, if you can see some change over time, what kinds of problems do you think going forward might sort of lend themselves to visualization of change over time that we wouldn't have expected?
So I'm looking for this one example, because I did do that. Sort of compared what I got using the old data to what I got using the new data, looked at where there were changes. There was one that was sort of the biggest.
We can help you find it. I mean, which question?
Yeah, it was question 84. I've been doing this for so long that I have the question numbers memorized. So it's this question: what do you call a traffic situation in which several roads meet in a circle and you get off at a certain point? This is from the old data. These maps were all using Dr. Box's data. And you can see here that there are some places that green in Massachusetts is rotary, the green in South Jersey is circle, just call them circles. And then there's this blue for roundabout. In the new data, roundabout is almost everywhere. It's just completely spread throughout the country. You can also see one of the other things is, it's called the caught distinction, between like a cot, like a bed, and caught, like you catch something. When some people say cot and caught, those two words sound the same. When some people say them, they sound different. The areas where people pronounce them similarly have been spreading, and it's a noticeable change from the old maps to the new one. You can see the spread of this caught merger happening throughout the country, which is sort of fascinating.
It's 15 years difference in the
About, 10, 15 years.
I'm originally from western Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh area, and I know that area has a lot of unique words that are very, very localized to a pretty small, relatively small area compared to the rest of the country. And I guess I'm just curious about, did you see a lot of those little small enclaves where for some reason there's a little pocket that had a different vernacular altogether?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the places where you see that the most are in northeastern cities. Northeastern cities, you get these very localized pockets of dialect. Actually, I should show you this thing. So this was another Shiny app that I don't think I ever actually released publicly, because Shiny is great, but the server I was using is just like a beta server. It is not set up to handle masses of internet traffic. So I kind of broke their server when I released the dialect maps the first time, and I didn't want to do that again. So with this thing, you can just click the map, and it'll show you these dialect clusters. So the red is where people speak similarly to that, and you can see, so that's Pittsburgh. Northeastern cities have these very localized, these very distinct dialect pockets. Right? There's these very small patches of red where people speak similarly. When you go west, everything spreads out much more. As you move south and west, everything kind of spreads out. Whereas in the northeast, it's these very tight little clusters. And Pittsburgh is a great example of that.
Back on the baseball maps.
Sure.
We were just, I had some friends and I and some dorks who also looked at it a bit, and we were just kind of curious, do you find anything interesting aside from the other things? Like we were wondering things like urban versus rural or college towns non?
Yeah, there were both. So we did baseball maps. We also did NBA maps a couple weeks ago, because why not? And we noticed that in urban areas, you would get a lot more sort of people reverting to the national team. So one thing you can notice here, if you look at Atlanta, the amount of Braves fandom is slightly less in Atlanta itself than in the suburbs of Atlanta. And there were or similar things like that. It's not always apparent from looking at the map, but if you zoom in and look at the actual numbers, you can see that in urban areas, you tend to have more Yankees fans than you do in rural areas.
You asked the question about where you grew up and where you live. Was there any predictive power in the where you live, and would you change the question given the results that you saw?
So there wasn't as much. It was where you were from or where you were raised you would see a much more stark regional differences when you looked at that map than you would with the where you live now. Which goes to demonstrate that these dialect things really are sort of burned into you from when you're raised, and they stay with you as you go on.
Besides making interesting charts for the newspaper to kind of talk about who we are, what about approaches for like scientific research? Do you think when you publish a paper, have you already talked to the scientific community about this?
So I was very recently a grad student, and I was sort of on that path. And I was in the process of writing this stuff up for a paper when I got sidetracked and ended up at the Times instead. And so all of that sort of got put to the side. But I think it has, so there already are spatial smoothing techniques out there. I find this one really compelling. So maybe in the future, at some point, I may consider that. If that answered your question.
Sure. I mean, can you address why it's so compelling, perhaps, or in terms of like scientific studies, or maybe studying dialects or some other geospatial distribution?
I feel like it's just something that just works really well as just a research communications tool. I think data visualization is good for that, but I'm still not sure I entirely understand what you're asking. Sorry. One more time.
Well, I mean, you addressed it, right? There's kriging, there's other geospatial smoothing techniques. So you stumbled across one that seems to communicate the data really well. People are excited about visualizing it this way. It seems like the human mind can think about this more easily than some other techniques of visualizing data and some aspects that are really the only way to study some sort of geospatially distributed phenomenon. So perhaps this might, I was wondering if you thought about how this would be applied to other things outside of, maybe they would be in the context of understanding the world through a newspaper, but perhaps there's some scientific field that also
Sure. I think one of the things is probably most of the spatial smoothing techniques that have been used before weren't dealing with this kind of content. So you had a lot of stuff with weather patterns you'd see, or like particulate matter, pollution. You would do something like this. I don't know how much it had been done in social sciences with culture and linguistics, and I think that's where this really has value, is in sort of merging spatial statistics with a lot of the social sciences. I feel like there's a lot of work that can still be done in that realm. Yeah.
Can you comment on the Mets? I assume you're a Phillies fan if you're from the area that you're from.
I'm actually a Red Sox fan. Oh, this is not the room for that.
But
so
is there a Mets pocket?
We made these kind of zoomed in areas of things that we found really interesting. Like this map. We wanted a Yankees-Mets map, but unfortunately the Mets did not have any areas that had a state Mets map. So we have a Yankees and also Yankees map. So the Mets fan base either just is not on Facebook at all. You could chalk it up to that.
It's been touched on in a couple of questions, but
can you speak a bit to the journey and transition from coming from an academic environment, like rigor, scientific kind of applications, and then transitioning towards more like telling the story, and where you as the storyteller or the editor looks at the data, decides what that story is, and like how do you balance that tension between being rigorous, but then also telling a compelling story that's going to attract 500,000 people to get involved with data?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ultimately, I don't think they're that different. I think a lot of what statistics does at its best is to tell stories with data. It's looking at a data set and figuring out what is the underlying meaning from this. How can I take this data and find the information within it? And in the newspaper setting, you're essentially doing the same thing. And hopefully, when you're doing it in a newspaper, you're also applying some kind of rigor and some kind of scientific method to your approach.
Right, so to kind of like continue with that, when you have like information, you have like all this information, and then you need to pull out what's important to make it impactful. And can you kind of like, what are some of the things you've learned, some of the skills or some of the techniques that you've learned in order to like kind of figure out what's the signal, what's the noise, what can I get rid of, and what's going to be the nuggets that people will...
It's a really difficult thing to do. Actually, that's one of the hardest things to do, is to start. Because you're just given this just amorphous data, and you're trying to figure out, all right, what does this want to be? What is this going to say? Like, what am I trying to say? Does the data, like, what story is in this data? I don't know if there is any kind of grand idea I could give in terms of what I've learned, except it is very helpful to step back, instead of just jumping right in and starting to make something, to just step back, think, sketch, and just really try and think about what it's trying to say before you start making something.
What are some of the like day-to-day techniques and like the way you interact with your team to whittle down and like come to that place?
It depends. I mean, a lot of the stuff where it's something like that is for like a daily graphic, so something that would be in the next day's paper. A lot of the times you're sort of, you do that on your own, or you can, go over to one of your editors and be like, so there's this, what do you think of this? What do you think of this approach? And you'll get great feedback. You can talk to the person sitting next to you and get great feedback from them. So yeah, it's very helpful working in an environment where you're surrounded by people who are great at what they do and are happy to help you kind of work towards a better end product. Yes?
You collected age and sex from the...
Yeah.
Did you see anything interesting? Were you able to predict sex, or was that a difference?
So with gender, no. I had started looking at age, and there were some things that might be interesting there. But yeah, there may be something in the future with that.
About the number of questions and the number of possible locations, you said there are like 14,000 locations on the matrix.
Yeah.
It's about like 16 bits. And you're asking 25 questions, so it's like half a bit of information per question. Like, any thoughts on that? Like, how many have you tried less questions?
Sure. But the fewer questions you ask, the less information you get, right? So it's a trade-off. Because ultimately what is really helpful is there are these questions that only people from one place say this one thing. Like the strip of grass in between the sidewalk and the street in Cleveland, that's a tree lawn. Everywhere else they don't have a word for it, but in Cleveland it's a tree lawn. So if you ask someone that, they say tree lawn, that's pretty much the only question you need. But if they don't say tree lawn, then you haven't learned very much. So you're trying to maximize your chances of getting one of those questions in your set.
So you mentioned at the beginning that you get interesting graphs, but the underlying questions and answers were maybe not such a surprise because people know where they're from or people sort of cheer for their hometown teams. So when you're looking at the graphs and you're choosing these 3 parameters or whatever to smooth out, did you find that there were anomalies and some of them you wanted to look into a bit further, or does everything kind of smooth out in the final representation? Is really a pretty comprehensive answer?
So I did, for the dialect maps, I maximized this, it's called the leave one out likelihood. So it sort of spared me from having to choose which parameters I want and which map I felt like looked the best. Because it was really trying to optimize this one function. So by doing that, it made those choices for me, which made things easier.
Do you have all the math and stats and discussion of your choices written up anywhere? I don't think it would get 350,000 views, but you know, because like these days it seems like it's popular to sort of present the results of math. But like, you know, what exactly is going on behind the hood of that Senate projection?
Actually, that is a great question. So our Senate model.
That is.
One of the other things we're trying to do at the Upshot is to bring more transparency to the work that we do and to the kinds of analysis that we're doing. So the Senate model, if you go to our GitHub page, you can find the code, all of the code and all of the data for our Senate model is online.
Yeah, well,
but you have to know R. That's the prerequisite.
But you're saying that you chose this thing to maximize for the dialect map, this thing to maximize not that thing, and this algorithm and not that algorithm for the, I just, it's not like an accusatory thing, like I don't believe you, but just that, there's some audience for people who want to know how to make those kinds of choices.
I mean, a lot of that stuff. So there is, like I said, for the original dialect maps was a project for a spatial statistics class, which was a poster presentation, and that poster is online. As far as writing something up, that was as much as I had done, but I feel like that has most of the information there to reproduce this technique. Beyond that, I feel like it's a lot of the kinds of things that, I feel like the poster gets you most of the way there. Yeah.
Did you think about including race, income, education, and why did you exclude those? Or was there any discussion? Was that just for the dialect maps when those choices were made? Were those?
This was for the pilot quiz that I did on our own. And I thought about it, and ultimately I elected to keep things simple. Because again, I thought it was a trade-off. Between the more information I asked, the less likely I was going to get people to answer.
Do you require the 25 questions all be answered, or do you collect data where people drop out, and at what point do you collect it?
It was all 25 questions. You had to finish the quiz for the data to be collected.
Okay, so there was no action. They had to go through it to get that result at the end.
Right.
Okay.
And I should say that the quiz that's on the time, like the Times quiz, the Times dialect quiz, is not collecting data.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious. 4 or 5 weeks ago, I guess they replaced the managing editor of the Times,
Yes.
and they have a new president, and there's a tension there between what they used to call the loose church and state, and between driving it more towards graphics and all, and looking at your Facebook, example of their baseball teams. I mean, looking at it, obviously it had some flaws in it, and but it was that good journalism, or was that like the other side of the business, the driving the new journalism of the times and the pressure? I know.
I mean, personally, I feel like journalism has a role to play in a lot of things, and essentially you're trying to uncover truth. That truth might be some kind of shady government business of like breaking news or things like that, or it might be kind of uncovering the way baseball fandom changes across the country, or how where you were raised affects the way that you talk now. It's not, I wouldn't describe it as hard news, but I still think it has a journalistic quality to it, and I think it has something to contribute to helping people understand the world and understand themselves.
I guess my point was the emphasis now in the newsroom, since you work right off on the edge, more of the seduction power of graphics and all this, multimedia and whatnot, compared to the old print, which is, there seems to be a tension. Probably you could.
I mean, ultimately, so with the print paper, you're competing for space, right? If any space for a graphic is going to be taking away space for text and vice versa. But it's all in the service of the same goal, which is telling a story. And sometimes a graphic, I think often, but I'm a little biased, I think often a graphic is the best way to do that. And a graphic can tell a story sometimes better and in smaller space than text can, or in a different way, in a way that just text would not be able to.
So you're fighting with the dinosaurs sometimes, the old guys, front page kind of people.
I wouldn't say that. I feel like I mean, I think it's a balance, and that both graphics and text have a role to play. I think most people who work there feel that way also.
I'm curious if you have an opinion about the way other news organizations like CNN use Twitter, where they kind of dip into the stream and pull out this information. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah. There are probably better ways that you can make use of social media, but to each his own, I suppose.
Thanks.
Yeah.
When creating a visualization, how much sort of thinking of the way that a map, for example, you can explore it, how do you balance between sort of getting your point across versus creating all these paths for a user to explore? In other words, it may become more complex and therefore harder to navigate, and maybe as a result would have less traction. So what kinds of decisions do you make to enable or show certain things?
Yeah, so that's a great question also. And I think the baseball maps, the way we tried to balance those two things was we both had this interactive, where did it go? This guy, where it's just completely open. You can zoom wherever you want, roll over wherever you want, get the exact numbers, just completely explore the space. But then in the article, sort of as a guide to that map, we then called out these particular areas of interest on the map that we found compelling, and made static images and sort of annotated them a little bit. And I feel like it's a mix of the two things. It is a hard thing to balance, but ultimately I think the interactive, by allowing people to immerse themselves in it, they can engage with it more. Yes?
Just a cute last question. Is there like a map for the World Cups on Thursday?
You will have to wait and see.
Thank you.
All right, well, that is all I got. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any announcements or anything they'd like to share with the rest of the audience before we go? Paul?
One quick announcement. If you are interested in reviewing one of the books, just make sure you either connect with me or write your information in a notebook, preferably books.
Great.
Can I say
Okay.
something? I teach Shiny. Go to my meetup. NYC Open Data.
Yeah, NYC Open Data runs a ton of great events, several per week a lot of the time. And Vivian also does very cool stuff, runs a school, so anybody who's looking for more experience and training with these tools, you should definitely talk to Vivian before you leave. And thanks again for shooting the video for us. And I think that's it. We've got more great presentations coming up in the months to come. And so we'll see you again in the near future. Take care.
Okay.